So, hello everybody. Welcome to the Florence School of Regulation, the FSR Talk. Today is a great pleasure to be the first time host of the FSR Talk, which is part of the online event series of the Florence School of Regulation. Today we are launching the FSR Talk with a different format. For those who follow the FSR online series and use it to see me as the FSR Insights, I have now moved to the FSR Talk, which with a great pleasure, and which now focus on the inviting speakers who could address topics on energy and climate regulation that are interesting to our global audience, not only those in Europe, but also those in Americas, Africa, and Asia. So therefore, I could not be better in company. For the FSR Talk, we have three hosts representing FSR. We have myself representing the FSR International and its sister schools outside Europe. So for that purpose, I have my colleagues, Carol Afafa, representing the Africa School of Regulation, and Sweta Ravikuma, representing the FSR Global based in India. And today's episode specifically, you have a very special speaking discussing a breakthrough work. One of the main challenges in the green transition is adapting governance. So regulation is the key government tool for achieving environmental goals. We would all agree with this statement, but which are the governance mechanisms for making better regulations, which we know in Europe we use this expression better regulation? Are they suitable for incorporating environmental concerns? So if you're thinking about regulatory impact assessments, are they incorporated stages in which they would take into consideration environment impact? And about the procedures on the stakeholders engagement. They are adapting as well for making sure that all people affected by the economic regulation, for instance, on the environment, they are being listened in this process. They have voices in this process. So 2 months ago, the EU OECD published the policy paper entitled Better Regulation for the Green Transition, which I think set the tone and we trust is the starting point for the reforms in the governance mechanism for making and monitoring better regulation. So to speak about this, we are welcome our guest, Daniel Trnka, so Deputy Head of Division of Regulatory Policy Division, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. So Daniel, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us. First, we will give the floor to you, to Daniel, so you can briefly introduce the report and move, afterwards we'll move it to a lively discussion. We are today episode, we're supposed to have our colleague Jorge Vasconcelos, who is a part-time professor at UI, as our invited discussion, but Jorge had an unforeseen meeting with the Secretary of Energy, so he could not be here today, but he sent his questions, and then Sweta will take over and address the questions prepared by Jorge. So I would like to, with no further ado, transfer the floor to Daniel, who is going to introduce the OECD report. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present our work in the field of better regulation for the green transition. Maybe just very quick run through the paper that was published in October last year and was developed thanks to the support of the Ministry of Environment in Korea that was actually very interested in this topic and provided a lot of support. So I have to thank the Korean ministry, which is not participating in this meeting, for their ongoing support for this work. And I will get back to this a little bit later because we are already in the second phase of this cooperation. But just let me give you a little bit of background. Why did we embark on this journey and working on the relation between regulatory policy or better regulation and the fighting climate change, protecting the environment? Of course, environmental goals are a priority for all governments now around the world, and therefore also for the OECD. However, regulatory policy or better regulation has been always perceived as something being inherently pro-business, even though we in the OECD have been saying that there are three important pillars of regulatory policy. You need to evaluate environmental, social, and economic impacts. The truth is that most of our countries, at least in the beginning of introducing regulatory policy, focused on reducing regulatory or administrative burdens for businesses. So we wanted to change the narrative a little bit and present regulation as something that can actually help governments to achieve their objectives. And if if the goal is environmental protection, regulations are one of the most important tools, as you mentioned in the beginning, Lucilla, that governments have at hand to actually achieve those goals, along with taxing, fiscal policies. Regulations might be the least costly option, at least for the government. Of course, then the cost for the rest of the society is another issue that we will get back to later. So this is why we drafted this paper on better regulation for the green transition that essentially sets the scene for where we would like to go in the future. So we are still at the initial stages of this work. We are still trying to collect information from our member countries, provide recommendations. But if you look at the paper that is available on the OECD website, it has all these elements that are listed on this slide. We look at regulatory management tools such as regulatory impact assessment or ex post evaluation, but we look a little bit beyond those, and we mentioned the important role international regulatory cooperation plays. What kind of a role can economic regulators play in this process? We talk about future-oriented regulations, etc. And I would just like to look into those individual elements in a little bit more detail. First of all, regulatory impact assessment. Now, most, if not all, OECD countries say that they have an obligation to evaluate environmental impacts as part of the RIA process, as part of developing new regulations. But again, coming back to what I said in the beginning, most of the countries have much better developed methodologies for measuring impacts on businesses, measuring economic impacts. Environmental impacts, then the quality of those methodologies and the attention that is actually paid to those impacts is rather limited. It varies country to country, but in many cases, these impacts are not evaluated as thoroughly as it should be. And if they are, it's mostly just the classical, I would say, environmental law. So something coming out of the Ministry of Environment or the agency protecting the environment, instead of all regulations, because all regulations can have impacts on the environment. And also, as part of the RIA process, sometimes countries do not look sufficiently on different alternatives, how the problem can be tackled, including non-regulatory options, and this is something that needs to be strengthened. What is also important, an important part of regulatory policy, is stakeholder engagement. And well, first, that's for the next slide, sorry. First, I want to talk about the ex post evaluation of regulations. We like to say in the OECD that all regulations are an experiment. We never know what exactly will happen in practice. And now with the pace of progressing of environmental threats, it's really important that we review our regulations regularly, more systematically, more frequently, and really regularly. We'll also, another thing we like to say in the OECD is that ex post evaluations are an unwanted child of regulatory policy. Not every government likes to look at policies and regulations that are in place and evaluate whether they are working or not. And we believe that in the future, this will be a cornerstone of successful regulatory policies around the OECD. Coming back to the issue of stakeholder engagement, again, all OECD countries in general have a policy on stakeholder engagement. They say that it's necessary to consult draft regulations with the general public. However, again, in many of those countries, legislative drafts are put online at the very final stage of the legislation making process. And then those responsible for drafting those regulations hope that not many comments will arrive because, of course, they are under a lot of pressure. They're almost done. They spent 3, 5, or even more months developing a law, they don't want to change it. And that's why it's important to engage with stakeholders early in the process, already when defining the problem. Another important aspect is that marginalized groups need to be consulted more. They don't have the resources, they don't have the capacities, and sometimes even not interest to get engaged with the government in the lawmaking process. One of the groups that is probably the most important is young people. They need to be consulted again more systematically because, I mean, for me, by the apocalypse arrives, I will be probably gone by then. But those young people might suffer through it. So they really need to have a say in the process of making regulations. And then last important element of regulatory policy, regulatory management tool is the delivery of regulations, how they are enforced, how compliance is promoted, how regulations are implemented. And we might set as many as we can nice environmental objectives, but if we are not able to implement policies and regulations in this field, they will never work, obviously. So we might support electric vehicles, for example, but when it takes more than a year to actually give a license to a charging station. So in Malaysia, for example, they are supporting electric vehicles, but most of the charging stations are in Kuala Lumpur. And if you want to go to the other side of the country, you probably stop in the middle and you have to walk because there are no charging station because the licenses and permits are not received so easily. So we need to think about the risks and trade-offs with achieving the environmental objectives when enforcing and delivering regulations. And again, we have much more material on this topic on our website. I've already mentioned the importance of international regulatory cooperation. Obviously, it goes without saying that environment is a global issue. I mean, air pollution doesn't stop at the border. Yet many countries are still dealing with those issues at the domestic level. What we are promoting is better international cooperation when it comes to protecting the environment. As part of RIA, for example, you can assess impacts on foreign subjects, foreign jurisdictions. Not many countries, as you can see from the graph, are doing it for the moment, and it needs to be incorporated. The idea of international regulatory cooperation, looking abroad when regulated, needs to be embedded in the thought process of our regulators. So about the future of regulatory policy in relation to the green transition, I would summarize probably that we need to foster an inclusive and coordinated approach to regulatory management tools. So engage more with stakeholders, talk about the problems we need to face, potential solutions, finding those solutions together. We need to move away from process-oriented regulations, but a little bit more to outcome-based and risk and behaviorally informed approach. I didn't mention behavioral insights, but it's also an important aspect in regulating. Connecting regulatory systems and going global, really thinking globally about how we protect the environment, and think about the paradigm shift that really puts the environment at the center of regulatory policy, of regulatory action. I've already mentioned that we are cooperating with the Korean Ministry of Environment. So on the last slide, I just want to present that we are now developing what we call a stress testing methodology. So we want to develop a tool that would help countries or the OECD to evaluate regulatory policy framework, to what extent these frameworks are ready for the green transition. That would mean looking exactly on to what extent environmental impacts are evaluated as part of RIA, stakeholders engaged, and all the things I've just mentioned. The toolkit should be ready by probably April or June at the latest. And this is how the results of such evaluation could look like. So it should help countries to actually look at their regulatory policy framework and think about, is it ready for the 21st century and for the problems we have to face, like the green transition or even the digital transformation? But that's for another presentation. I will stop here. Happy to answer any questions. But again, if you are interested, this is the address of our website, of our LinkedIn group. If you want, you can send me an email. I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you for really summarize with the precision and perfect time the work that OECD has developed that you have coordinated. And I would say that it's let's start our FSR talk. The purpose here is to discuss, is to address questions, is to provoke it and to understand it better and even present it in future tools. So I will straight away move the word to Sweta, because as I have said it before in the beginning, we had invited Professor Jorge Vasconcelos, a great colleague, to join us at this discussion. Jorge has an unforeseen event, but nevertheless send the questions, which we appreciated very much, Jorge. Thank you. So Sweta, I think it's to you to represent George and in his behalf address his nice questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Lucila. Thank you, Daniel, for that very crisp presentation. For some of us who are new to the RIA model and trying to understand that, I think it was a very, very good overview. So I think questions from George were, I think, at a very fundamental level, going back and asking some of these questions. So I think his first question here is, there is currently no standard approach to the role of economic regulators in contributing to environmental policy objectives. So what could be some of the good models or practices to follow in this regard? If there are some examples already or talks, you could share that with us. But otherwise, what should be kept in mind while we have these two talking to each other?
Thank you. I mean, the short answer is no, because unfortunately, I don't have any such examples at hand because we are just now analyzing the input we collected through our survey on indicators of regulatory quality that should be published early next year. However, we already have some numbers that I can share with you, but basically from the survey, we saw that there is no standardized approach to setting environmental objectives for economic regulators. Actually, less than half of regulators we surveyed said that they have some kind of objectives relating to environmental sustainability and legislation, and more than a third do not have any objectives like this defined at all. There are huge variations even inside one country, of course, among regulators, among countries, regarding the scope of regulators' contributions to environmental sustainability, difference between sectors. So I would be happy to come back to you with some good examples. But like I said, for now, we are still collecting the information. So if anyone among participants has some good examples, we would be happy to hear them.
Thank you, Daniel. Then I think the follow-up questions are going to be tougher, I guess. So I think the next question is more about trying to look at if there's a transparent and clear and effective way in trying to assess the regulatory trade-offs among competing economics, the social and the environmental objectives. So what has been your experience so far mapping the different geographies?
So first, thank you for the question. And first, let me give you some numbers again, some very preliminary numbers from the survey. Actually, our regulators, a majority of our regulators consider environmental sustainability goals that are conflicting with some of their other goals. And looking at the numbers here, 81% of them said that there is a direct conflict between their goals in the environmental sphere and the goal in terms of improving cost effectiveness. Then around 60% of them said that there is a conflict between environmental sustainability and promoting competition, and still above 50%, 57%, I think, said that there's a conflict between environmental sustainability and promoting consumer welfare or social inclusion. So as you see, economic regulators are struggling because in the beginning, again, their primary goal was to take care of fair competition, leveling playing field in their specific area they were recommending. Then after the financial crisis, in some countries, they were giving another goal to promote economic growth. And now governments are adding to this basket another goal, environmental sustainability, that might be directly conflicting with those other goals. So again, we are at the very beginning of this journey, but we are feeling that regulators are actually struggling with this issue, how to actually achieve all those competing goals. But moving away from economic regulators, I would like to say that if you look at what was happening in Germany last week and is happening right now in France, where I live, is that the farmers are protesting and blocking highways and blocking the capital in case of Germany. And that's exactly because maybe we tend to forget that there are these three pillars. So there is economic growth, there is the environmental objectives, and there are social goals, if you will, or just policies. And in some cases, even though we set objectives that are definitely commendable and that we would probably all agree with, such as the achieving protecting the climate and tackling climate change, we tend to forget about the potential costs and the impacts this will have on certain groups in our society. And then further down the road, we have protests in front of the presidential palaces and prime minister's offices because we maybe didn't engage with those groups of stakeholders enough. We didn't explain the goals properly, but maybe we didn't evaluate the potential impact sufficiently. And it's time, coming back to our paper, to evaluate what exists, to think about the impact, and maybe to adjust.
Yeah, I totally feel your pain. I do study the regulatory policy here in a complex country like India, where we have a federal and a state level engagement multiplied across all of these sectors that you did mention. And yes, consumer engagement and stakeholder engagement is an active process of that. I think it should be from the very beginning as opposed to the end of the cycle. But that's a hard learning that we all do. I think the next question here is, since you brought this up, then are there any already agreed upon international cooperation towards bettering this integration of relevant policies and regulatory aspects? Would there be some sort of a common working group or a platform where all these learnings from different parts of the world can come together, which OECD will aggregate?
I mean, there are many examples of different discussion platforms and policy frameworks as part of the United Nations, for example, or regional networks in Asia, in Europe as well. The OECD as well, of course, is discussing a lot those issues. But to be a little bit more concrete, and I don't have to go too far, in the OECD, we host, our colleagues from the Environmental Directorate host what is called a mutual acceptance of data system. So the abbreviation is MAD, I don't know why, that allows countries to, or a country to accept lab results for chemical safety regulations from other participating countries. So individual countries do not have to run their own labs and do their own tests, but they can basically accept the results from other countries. And our colleagues did a cost-benefit analysis, and it concluded that there is a net positive benefit for governments and the industry, estimated to be around 310 million euros annually. So that's quite something. Another thing, and I'll stop there, what we are now considering is to create an international repository of impact assessments for environmental regulations. So again, if you're trying to regulate something domestically, you would look into this registry repository and look at whether other countries around the world maybe did similar impact assessment, and you could then use the results. But that's for the future. That doesn't exist yet.
Excellent. I think that would be very useful, especially if you put the CBA results out there and why one can use such a repository. Then I think the last question that George had for you is looking at, does OECD intend to promote enhanced institutional cooperation amongst different regulators, aimed at, of course, improving the quality of regulatory outcomes and the overall overarching policy goals that you have?
So there, the short answer is yes, of course. We're trying to, like I said, environment is one of the biggest priorities for the current leadership of the OECD, for the organization as such. In our community, we are serving as a secretariat of the so-called Regulatory Policy Committee. So delegates from all our countries gather in Paris twice a year, and we create a platform for, let's say, a policy dialogue. We're developing recommendations. We're developing analytical papers such as this one. I've already mentioned the stress testing toolkit that we would like to finalize in the first half of this year and probably test on some countries. So if there are any volunteers among the participants, please send me an email. We also have our network of economic regulators where we have water, energy, telecom, other regulators that also meet in Paris or virtually and focus a lot on the issues related to environmental protection. But we also provide technical assistance, and we did a lot of work with individual countries such as the Netherlands, Lithuania, and others, Portugal, in the sphere of delivering regulations and with specific focus, for example, on hydrogen technologies or others. So making regulatory delivery more risk-based, more evidence-based, that's a topic that is really close to our heart.
I think on that note, it's back to you, Lucila. Regulatory delivery is the key word for Lucila. So I'm handing it back to you.
Thank you, Sueta. Thank you so much. I think I appreciated very much that you addressed the questions raised by George. And it's quite nice because I think there was in the presentation of Daniel, he summarized, he took the 4 key points of the report, which was to address the better governance in ex ante, how it should change regulatory impact assessment, move it to ex post, and then we engage it with deal with the challenge of engaging stakeholders to create a stakeholders engagement. And you move to the regulatory delivery of environment, including, like as a nice example, I got very curious to know a bit more about the environmental regulation. I would, before addressing my question, I will ask my colleague Carol if she wanted to address any question and perhaps address and say, okay, what is your question will be related, and then I can move to be, and then you can continue our talk.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lucila. I think my question is related to what has been discussed, but at least with a bit of a context within Africa. The report talks very clearly about stringency and flexibility in developing regulation. So, for example, we have taxes on polluting fuels, while increasing, are still too low to encourage a shift to low carbon alternatives in the green transition. How do you achieve stringency and flexibility in the case of environmental policy instruments or policy design to actually inspire the transition for countries that are still lagging behind with regards to environmental policy?
Well, that is a difficult question, I have to admit, and I'm not sure if I have an answer to this, but my personal take on this would be, again, strengthening international regulatory cooperation in this aspect. So, as a country, do not be selfish, but really think also about other countries and not just in terms of looking right across your border, but really look at developing countries, countries that are only at the initial stages of either introducing environmental policies or even regulatory policy. And then I think partial answer is also in strengthened stakeholder engagement. So again, talking to stakeholders, administrations need to be proactive in reaching out to stakeholders, especially in such countries where maybe people might trust their governments a little bit less, or they might not be so willing or at least accustomed to get engaged with their governments in the lawmaking process. So again, it's the role of governments to reach out go out of their ivory towers and really talk to their stakeholders. And then again, I mean, it's the role of academic institutions also to gather evidence and to provide policymakers with evidence on what the potential impacts of such policies and regulations will be, again, not just domestically, but internationally, that could help makers to make better informed decisions. But like I said, that's my view. I'm not sure we have a definitive answer here in the OECD.
Yes, I do understand it's not an easy question, but I think that the main point is, of course, flexibility, stringency, which is encompassed under stakeholder engagement, going to the ground, and also having cross-border conversations around regulation that then harmonizes these very key topics. Lucila, I'll hand it back over to you. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Fantastic, Kara. Thank you so much. I think, Daniel, I would follow a couple of questions. I think we have visited some of your answers that you gave to George's questions. Some curiosities that I have thinking about it. We started from the ex-ante, which I think regulatory impact assessment. We used to have a training to the regulators, and usually regulators are very interested in regulatory impact assessment, how to do it. A data set about how to do RIAs including environment. I think it's a great idea, definitely. To answer the questions, but many of them are. Well, I think the question is, if you wanted to incorporate it in environmental impact assessment in regulatory, what could be the type of here? Because you have many ways of doing regulatory impact assessment. So you have the cost benefit analysis, you have the and most of them like the cost benefit analysis, has a slight preference. But sometimes what they said is like, if I wanted to incorporate it environmental concerns, the cost-benefit analysis might be complicated because I don't have data with the costs of environment. So it's harder to know the real costs that it creates to the environment. So they end up by moving to other types of regulatory impact assessments. Did you find it this is why you are collecting data from the regulators?
Well, I can understand these complaints because before joining the OECD many years ago, I used to work for national administration on regulatory impact assessment. So I know how difficult it is actually to do a RIA and to integrate all these impacts. And we hear a lot of complaints from our members that on what we call a Christmas tree problem. So in the beginning, it was about administrative cost and regulatory burdens. Then, you added environmental impacts, social impacts, you have gender impacts, impacts on sustainability, and it just goes on, and it's not possible for just one person to grasp all these different techniques and methodologies and get all the data. So first of all, our answer is RIA is a multidisciplinary issue. RIA cannot be done by just one person in the ministry. I mean, if you're developing a law, it shouldn't be done just by a lawyer. You need some data scientists. You need to have some economists on board. You need to have people that are able to analyze and process information. That's one thing. So, I mean, obviously, if you're developing a law that will have significant impacts on the environment, the first person you need to call is someone from the Ministry of Environment or Environmental Protection Agency or whoever to get involved in the process and to consult from a very beginning. You have a lot of environmental NGOs that will be, if they have resources and they have the information, they will be more than happy to help you with the analysis. And then the other part of what you said is the lack of data. And yeah, I mean, in my career, I heard that a lot. We don't have enough information. We don't have enough data. Now, I think, now when your mobile telephone knows more about you than your partner or your kids, it's mostly an excuse. It's not just the data do not exist. We are just not able to collect them, to process them, to extract them, and to get the information out of this data we need. So that's why the way governments operate need to change. They need to learn how to work with the data and how to get the information. Now, it's easy to say from Paris. I understand that. I mean, the cultural change needs some time to manifest itself, but it is possible. And every time we're working on an analysis and we don't have the data, at least we should think about how to make sure that next time we will have them. So once we do the ex post, 2 years down the road, 3, 5 years down the road, we will actually have those data. So at least start collecting them if you don't have them.
Okay. And one thing that I thought it was curious from your answer. What do you think is the most common, I would say, strategy the governments are doing, for instance, for regulatory impact assessment? Are they, for instance, I have an agents, I have a energy agents, national regulatory agents. Are they created internal departments with more knowledge on environment to engage in the team for? Or do you think there has been more cooperation with environmental ministers, with environmental agencies in this economic? What is the strategy that you see most common, and what do you wish to see?
Maybe I start with the second part. I think, again, RIA is a multidisciplinary task. And I honestly do not think that it's possible, especially for smaller countries that have limited capacities, to create or to have a person in every single ministry and every single agency that would have experience with, environmental impacts. And then you have also other categories of impact. So you would need in every single ministry a bunch of people that would be experts on environment, gender, social impacts, distributional impact, etc. So it's more about a support from the center, but I wouldn't say that there is one model that anyone would copy. I think there is a group of countries that are creating analytical capacities in the center, in the government office, or whoever is responsible for coordinating regulatory policy, and kind of help and support countries in carrying out the analysis. In some countries, still it's the case that there is one contact point, one person responsible for RIA in every ministry, every agency, and then this poor person has to collect the information from wherever he or she can. And of course, it's a difficult task. And then you get these complaints that we don't have the information, we don't have the data.
It's curious. Fantastic. I would assume the same, like from what I have discussed with them. It's like this is a big question. Actually, many regulators ask me, like, should I change my team? And should I hire people who understand from environment, or should I rely on the then I have the issues of bureaucracy, of lack of cooperation with another minister's fragmentation and so on. But it's very interesting. I haven't seen more and more often. I have.
You can always use external resources. You can use academics, you can use think tanks, but the most important thing is that the process of impact assessment really informs the process of regulation, of developing the regulation. So it's not like you draft a law, then send it to someone to do an impact assessment, then they will send it back. You don't understand a single word, but you send it to the government and you can tick a box, there is a RIA. No, you need to work hand in hand, and what their analysis should inform your process of decision making on what the best solution would be.
Fantastic. And one thing as well about continue with the ex ante, which is also related with ex post, is so connected with if we're speaking about making regulation and we're speaking about assessing the output of the regulation itself. But one thing that I like in the report, and I think it's a consensus, is that when you speak about the environment, people tend to have the true vision and focus on climate, because the political discourse ends up being focused more on climate issues. But you have not only climate issues, you have biodiversity issues, you have like residuals issues, you would have plastic pollutions, air pollution, that is not necessarily greenhouse gas emission. When you were designing, I don't know to what extent you can anticipate about the toolkit that you said that you were trying to design. It's coming out very soon. Are you thinking how you were making sure, how you were ensuring that actually regulators thinking on environment in its complex? It is very hard if you don't have environmental training behind it.
It is very difficult. It needs a lot of training, and I would go even further. In my experience, many civil servants in many administrations still think that environmental protection and all these plethora of problems we have there, this is the issue of the Ministry of Environment. I mean, we don't have to care about it. We work for the Ministry of Transport. We take care of transport, and the Ministry of Environment will take care of the environment. But that's not how modern governments should work. And this goes a little bit beyond the work of our division that really focuses on regulation, but we have colleagues here that work with the centers of government and with strategic management and priority setting as part of the administration. And what they are saying is that more and more we are really facing horizontal problems, whether it's aging population, whether it's environment, many others, technological development, and these problems need to be tackled horizontally. Governments shouldn't work in silos. They really should work in, working groups, committees, whatever, coordinated by the center of government. It is still not the case in many of our countries. Let's be honest about that. But the culture is slowly changing towards that. So again, you don't need everyone to fully understand, and I don't. I'm not an expert on environment. I don't understand all the issues, and I don't even know how many of them are there, but at least they should know whom to call or whom to discuss with. And again, stakeholders can help in this aspect as well.
Fantastic, Daniel. We have many questions coming. You spoke about silos. I was reading the questions coming in the Q&A, and please, if for the participants wants to address question, just continue. And I said a question from Violet, and she works on studies on this. I'm going to address her question in the others very soon, but I would like to open another box, because I think it's something, I think it'd be everything that comes to the mind, and it's in this many discussions when we're speaking about the stakeholders engagement. That we needed to, of course, needed to have the stakeholders engagements, but now you were facing quite often what you call not in my backyard movement, in which people wanted to, you have the stakeholders engagements, but at the same time you would face this negative or this counter arguments about projects that would be good for the environment, for reasons of aesthetic reasons, and this is a concern about, okay, how you design stakeholders engagement, and you identify when you have this kind of if you put in a trade-off, the justifications for not backyard is not just justifiable, and how to separate them from stakeholders engagement, right? This is my curiosity.
You're asking me difficult questions to say. But again, what I would say is that this not in my backyard problem results very often from the lack of understanding, or there might be prejudices. This technology might be dangerous for me. These people might be dangerous for me. I don't want them close to where I live. So one of the answers is really deeper stakeholder engagement, if you will. A lot of explanations, not be afraid to go out and talk to local stakeholders. But having said that, stakeholder engagement is not a referendum. We still have politicians that are elected to make decisions. Sometimes those decisions are difficult. So it is important to really engage in the process with stakeholders. It's important to give feedback, but it doesn't mean that 100% of complaints or 100% of comments can be taken on board. It's very often not possible because they might be contradicting. So it's up to the politicians then to make those decisions. What is quite important, and we always stress that, is that you need to provide feedback. You need to explain. If you do not take something on board, you do not implement something, you need to say why, because that's the only possibility how to get people on board.
Fantastic. I think it's very controversial. I mean, especially being based in Portugal, we have like the issues with, for instance, the lithium mine, and it's always controversial. And sometimes I had the impression that that either is yes or no, and the between. Because one thing of the environmental impact assessment stage is the mitigation, adaptation, and compensation. and a deep reflection. Okay, if you needed to go for a project that would have impacted assessment, but it would have been the cross in the trade-off, it would be better either to continue, how ways of compensating local communities that will be affected, for instance. And this would be perhaps my impression, but don't know to what extent you experienced this, and I assume regulators would also explain to you. But I think that before moving to the questions, I think there was a very nice example on, and you said that this project actually started from the Korean, with an incentives and motivation from a toolkit that the Korean government would like to develop. And I noticed that when it comes to permitting license, which is the delivery environment part, they changed the environmental impact assessment, and they included 10 stages from the environmental impact assessment. Can you explain a bit more, if you would able to explain, okay, what did they change for the traditional environmental impact assessment?
I'm afraid I don't have information on that. Sorry. Is it a Korean example or?
I think it was
No.
okay, but I think it was a Korean one on the legal environmental regulation permitting license. But as well, there was also another example, I think the Portuguese one. I don't want to use too much examples to Portugal, because otherwise we'll create a bias from what I can. On the single European permitting platform. It was a facilitation of governance. I thought it was super cool tool, governance tool for facilitate it, simplify, harmonize it, these 12 different environmental permits.
Yep. Well, I mean, it's an interesting example, and we're still working on a project with APA, with the Portuguese Environmental Protection Agency, on improving this system. And on one hand, the biggest goal was actually to reduce burdens for those asking for environmental licenses. So integrating all those licenses into one IT platform and making it basically easier to get these licenses, because you can do it online, you can do it 24/7. Obviously, to send the request, you just add the data into the platform, and that you should get the results in due time. However, during the process, we also discovered some issues. Maybe too much emphasis was put on digitalization, and a little bit less on whether you actually need those licenses and what is the purpose, and whether maybe you could get rid of those. So what we are suggesting is actually a comprehensive review of all these licenses. Are they really needed? Is establishment of a business in this particular area or this particular sector creates so much risk that you have to go through this whole process of getting a permit or a license? And what we discovered also in Portugal, and I hope my Portuguese colleagues will not be mad at me for, disclosing this information before finalizing the project, but sometimes risk is not exactly the primary issue when thinking about either licensing or inspection. So that's another thing we are recommending. Improve your risk assessment system. Plan your inspections a little bit more according to the risk. Take into account what is the risk of and what will be the impacts of if something bad happens. So that will be the results of the project. We will have a final conference in Lisbon in April, I believe. So happy to share the results of this project with you later on this year.
Oh, definitely. It would be a great pleasure. I think we have more than 10 minutes because it's before the end of the event, but of course I wanted to address the questions, the Q&A. And I think there was one, we started from the question from Violet, and I think it's very related to what you are mentioned about it. And what she wants to ask is like, do you, from what you have seen in governments, do you think they are making amendments on the better regulation process itself, or is more on terms of guidelines? No, they are changing guidelines to make as an attempt to incorporate environmental concerns, or do you think they are truly amended the better regulation procedures in their countries?
I mean, in some countries, yes, it really varies from country to country, and so does the implementation of regulatory management tools as such without the environmental perspective. In some countries, in fact, in a lot of countries, it's still a formalistic process. So first you have a draft regulation, and then the impact assessment is done to tick a box, but it doesn't contribute to the quality of the decision-making process. And it's similar with analyzing environmental impacts. In some countries, they're really taking it seriously. They're trying to include sustainability perspective, if you will, in the whole process. So they are not just developing methodologies, but also strengthening oversight. So if you have a regulatory oversight body, the body really needs to look at all the three pillars, whether economic, social, environmental impacts have been analyzed properly as part of the impact assessment. So some countries are taking it seriously. Others are still in the initial stage. It's still a very formalistic process. And in some countries, let's be honest, these regulatory management tools are seen as an additional layer of administrative burdens for the administration. So not very popular. We're trying to change that. Takes time.
I think it's very common because it's seeing like, I think sometimes the perception of incorporating environmental risks is very similar to what happens in companies. So when you are working with, for instance, ESG reports that companies has to make it, I think it's a very similar complaint of the companies, because they said usually the ESG departments are very isolated and it's harder to disseminate it this throughout all entirely companies. So you can make this analogy between the difficulties. So you can like in the environmental impact assessment as well. But I think related to your answer, there is another question in the Q&A from Kestutis Starkos, and she was kind of it was a moment in your presentation. She wrote her question early in the beginning, and they said it was a bit curious to know more when you said that only 5 to 7 OECD countries assess risk for environmental regulation, and the EU is also among this that they never do. So could you please elaborate a bit more the situation of EU regarding this aspect?
Well, first of all, I need to say that the data I presented might be a little bit outdated. They are from our previous round of the IREX survey, because we are right now, as I said, finalizing the analysis of the 2023 survey, and will be published, discussed later on this year in the OECD, and probably published next year, early next year, because the publication process is rather long here in the OECD. So now it might be more countries. I'm not, from the top of my head, able to talk about the concrete situation in the EU, but in general, risk assessment is still not a firm part of regulatory impact assessment frameworks in most of our countries. It's still a slightly foreign concept, even though we here in the OECD, at the Regulatory Policy Committee, organized several sessions on, risk assessment, risk measurement. That's part of regulatory reviews. We started, maybe it was even 15 years ago, talking about risk, but it's still not something that is perceived a firm part of regulatory policy and regulatory reviews. So that probably explains partially the low number.
Mm-hmm. In fact, it's not on my knowledge. At least the better regulation documents in itself of the Commission has not been revised. And indeed, if you look at it step by step, what they recommended to be analyzed, there is no explicitly reference for environmental risk assessment. It doesn't mean that in case by case it's not done, but in the document, in the framework in general, has not this step. And of course, I think this is a clear message, the OECD document for the amendment, for possible amendment of the better regulation document of the Commission to incorporate this and not led to the case by case situation. And I think we will have like one question. I think it's a very common law jurisdiction. I don't know, but it was coming from Visual. And she was mentioned, when you think about toolkit applied to common law jurisdictions, to what extent you see it's hard, so it's in a different way of when you are applying for non-common law jurisdictions?
Well, I don't see a huge problem there because the toolkit will really look at the overall framework for regulatory policy. So it's really about the process of impact assessment, the process of stakeholder engagement, ex post reviews, and these processes do not differ that much between common and continental law. Even the concept of impact assessment comes from mostly common law jurisdictions. So I think we can look at the quality of this process with the toolkit without really running into difficulties in this sense. Having said that, I understand the second half of the questions because the judicial decisions might alter the interpretation of the law. But then it's a question for more, again, coming back, more regular, more systematic ex post reviews of the existing regulations, taking into account the judicial decisions, taking into account the impacts those regulations have in real life, and then, if necessary, adjusting those laws and regulations.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think for just to close the event, we still have 4 minutes to go. If you would like to say a few words about what is coming on the toolkit, what do you think? Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's important? Why do you think people need to read it? And how do you think the government really needed to embrace this toolkit? Which, of course, I'm very curious on how to know more about it. But why do you think it's if you would sell this form, how you would be stressing from this document? What is coming from this document?
Well, I mean, the toolkit should be really a tool that governments can use to self-evaluate, or potentially they can even use the OECD to evaluate their regulatory policy frameworks, which we do even now. We do regulatory policy reviews, so we look at the quality of implementation of our 2012 recommendations. But if you ask me why countries should use this toolkit, like I said in the beginning, regulation is probably one, if not the most important tools that governments have to achieve their objectives. And environmental protection, tackling climate change, is the top priority for most of the governments around the world. So if they want to really use the right tools to achieve this goal, if you want these tools to be effective and efficient, regulation is here to help them. But regulation needs to be based on evidence, needs to be sound, needs to be consulted properly, needs to be risk-based, etc. Without it, we run into huge problems. Regulations will not work in the future. We might have farmers protesting in capitals or other groups of the society because the impacts will be disproportionate, or because they will not understand why we are using those tools. So in a nutshell, if governments want to achieve their goals, they need to use effective tools. And to use effective tools, they need to have a framework that will contribute to developing those effective tools. And this is regulatory policy.
Thank you so much, Daniel. With these final words, I would like just to close the event, of course, saying being grateful to you for your time to be here with us, to the audience for the questions and answers, and also for my colleagues Sveta and Carol for co-hosting. We are starting a journey of this FSR talk, and I'm very happy that we started so good with such a great work and contributions. Thank you so much, you all, and hope to see you next month.
Thanks for having me. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.